notes. I want to talk to you about a Cornerstone Story. We are in a story. We have a story. Our story is one that's not just... Our story is a bunch of individual stories that weave together that make a group story. And that is one of the essentials of life. It is certainly the way the body of Christ works. And so we're going to look at how there was a story about Israel and look at some applications that come from there and what's involved in that story. So I did this in first service, so do it now. If you were here, if you are a charter member of Cornerstone Baptist Church, you were here on the first day this church started 42 years ago. Would you stand? And I'm only doing that because I know there's someone here that it was. Gary was, and Jane and Mary. Jeff Chase and some in the early service were. Jane's downstairs, 42 years later, still serving. Nope, go ahead and stay standing. Thanks. If you've been a part of Cornerstone for, let's say, 15 years or more, would you stand? Say 15 years. And I'm not going to make you tell me the date. So if you think it was about that, 15 years or more, would you stand? Okay. Man, Jim, 15 years, you remember? That's great. All right. If you've been a part of Cornerstone for 10, okay, there's a story that some people have chapters that others don't. Some people, the story was woven in different ways. If you've been a part of Cornerstone for like 10 years or so, would you stand? Okay? All right. Cool. If you've been a part of Cornerstone for, say, 5 years or more, would you stand? Okay, you were waiting for it, weren't you? I saw some jumpers. All right. Now I want to pause just a moment because this is exciting. It's exciting to see, not to call attention to you if you're recent, but it's exciting to see that there's a lot of new people in our church. That's a great thing. So, and if you've been a part of Cornerstone, I won't make it. So if you've been a part of Cornerstone for 5 years or less, would you stand and be a part of all the rest of us? Because you're a part of our story. If you've been a part of Cornerstone for 5 minutes, would you stand? There's some first-time visitors hopping up today, Hey, or up to... Okay, so here's the deal. All of us are a story. All of us have a story. And all of us together become a story. And I want to talk to you about the story of Cornerstone, or a story of Cornerstone. Thanks, you can be seated. I'm done with that part of it. In Exodus chapter 12, Exodus is the part of the book of the Bible that tells us about the children of Israel leaving Egypt. And in verse 50, the last verse of that chapter, it says this. And by the way, the verse could start like this. Once upon a time. Once upon a time, all the people of Israel followed all the Lord's commands to Moses and Aaron. And on that very day, the Lord brought the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt like an army. Once upon a time, a story, wherever a story begins, there is history to it. And usually in any book, there is some kind of giving you historical perspective, who this character is, what's happened in their lives, because a story may have a beginning point, but there is history that goes in advance of that. And then a story may come to an end, but there's always more. There's always a way to bring Spock back from the dead and have another episode with all, there can be another chapter, another story. So we pick up in this story where there's this victory being celebrated. Passover has taken place. They painted the doorpost and their children were spared. All the Egyptian children and every firstborn animal and human were killed, and God brought Israel out. And we come to this great crescendo at the end of chapter 12, and it says, and God brought them out And we could put a period there and say, what a story. Or we could start that verse with, once upon a time, because there's so much more to it. Because they haven't even crossed the Red Sea yet. The big miracle of the Red Sea parting and they went across, that hasn't even come yet. He's let them out, but they're not even there yet. And Israel had a story. And I want to look at, in the next chapter, some pieces that God challenges, that God gave in the story. And if God was that way then, He is that way today. And I've loved God with my life. I know how He works in our lives. And He doesn't always make it easy for us. He doesn't always give us the easiest path. And there are challenges that God puts in our way because He loves us and because He knows what we need. And He did so with Israel as well. So Israel's story was that. I want to talk about, first we see a call to sacrifice. In chapter 13, the next verse says this, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Dedicate to me every firstborn among the Israelites. The first offspring to be born, both humans and animals, belongs to me.'" There was a call to sacrifice. And if you know Christ, and if you want to follow God, if you want to be His disciple, there's going to be a call to sacrifice at some point. And if right now you don't feel that, right now there's not an impression or a tug on you, and you don't feel like you're sacrificing something for God, you feel like right now it's not, just wait, it's coming. There'll be a sacrifice that God will ask for. In fact, step one of discipleship, Jesus said, look, you want to be a disciple? Let me tell you what page 1 is. Let me tell you, before you even get started, here's what page 1 is. Deny yourself. That's sacrifice. And take up your cross daily. The instrument of death. That means I want you to deny your own stuff, and I want you to die to your selfish ways, to your own abilities, to your own ways. I want you to put those aside and kill those. Put those on the altar. Take up your cross daily and follow me. That's page 1 of discipleship. Sacrifice is not only required, it's essential to demonstrate that we have more than just a casual relationship with Christ. That we want to be His follower. And in our lives, God asks us and brings us to the point and calls us to sacrifice. And as I was preparing the message, I started jotting down, it's like I'm throwing ideas around and I'm like, okay, so I'm thinking about things in my life that I feel like I've sacrificed in order to be in ministry, or sacrificed in order to take a stand as a believer, and things that so I'm going back and I'm identifying these things, and then it just kind of caught me off guard. I was just like, wait a minute. Those aren't sacrifices. I didn't sacrifice anything. And if I go back to those days and that point and that moment, then it was sacrificial. It was a decision. It was saying yes when I wanted to say no, or it was saying no when I wanted to say yes. And it was setting myself aside and doing what I believed was God's will. And so at that moment, I thought to myself, this is a sacrifice that I'm making because I want my life to count for God. And so I'm jotting some of those things down, and I just want to tell you, I'm looking at it now from this perspective, and I look back at those things and I go, yeah, that wasn't really a sacrifice. I didn't really give up anything. I'm glad I made that decision, and God has blessed that choice and those choices. And I look back at those things that I thought were sacrificial, and they really aren't. They've been for my benefit all the way. Now, the thing that I'm facing today and the issues in my life today, they feel like sacrifice. They feel like taking a stand and making the... But is it easy to understand that one of these days in glory I'm going to look back and say, I didn't sacrifice anything? Not really. But God calls us to sacrifice. He said, man, I brought you out of Egypt. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to dedicate my firstborn, your firstborn. Ooh. And God's going to call for something from you. He's going to call for sacrifice. If you want to be His disciple, He's going to ask you to lay yourself aside. going to call us to sacrifice. The second thing that I see is a call to devotion. Look in chapter 13, verses 6 through 10. He says this. For 7 days the bread you shall eat may be made without yeast. And on the seventh day, I want you to celebrate a feast to the Lord. I want you to eat bread without yeast during these 7 days. In fact, there should be no yeast among you, or yeast found within the borders of your land during this time. And on the seventh day, I want you to explain to your children. I want you to explain to your children. I want you to tell your kids about your faith and about what God has done in your life. And I'm celebrating what the Lord did for me when I left Egypt. And man, there need to be those times at your dinner table or before bed where you're telling your kids about what you've done to choose Christ instead of yourself. And we can't take a casual approach to discipleship and expect our children to be dedicated to Christ. And our teenagers to make difficult choices about serving God instead of selfishness. I want you to every year, I want you to do this thing that they celebrate as Passover. I want you to remember what we did, and I want you to tell your kids about it and make a difference. Pass it on. The commitment that you live, I want your kids to see it and know it. And my kid, I had one of my sons in the early service, and my kids don't, I didn't tell my kids this week, hey, don't wipe your nose on your sleeve. I didn't tell them chew with your mouth closed. I mean, we're past that. But I'm going to tell you what my kids still need. They still need a dad that's going to stay faithful to God. They still need to know as they're living their life and they're taking their chances and they're taking their steps of faith that there's an anchor that can keep you in life. I don't care where you're at in your life. God says, there ought to be a dedication. There ought to be a dedication, a devotion to God that goes beyond showing up to church on Sunday. I'm glad you're here. But a devotion to God goes with you tomorrow. It goes home with you when you leave this room. It's worshiping God in the way you work. It's worshiping God in the way you conduct yourself at home and your family, and the honesty and the integrity and the way your family sees you. That's worship. A devotion. I want you to celebrate this thing, and I want you to tell your kids about it. And this is not just this passage. I mean, on and on he goes. Deuteronomy 6. I want you to teach your children. Write it on your forehead. Write it on your wrist. Tell your kids about how God has worked in your life. Don't let the next generation come. And the generation after Joshua didn't get it. A devotion. It has to do with remembering. You know when my problem starts, Mike Vauters, when my problem starts is when I quit remembering. When I get a little bent sideways with God, or things get a little cold, or I'm reading the Bible and doesn't feel like it's even alive, it's because I've begun to forget about how good God is. I've begun to forget about. I begin to think about what He owes me instead of what I owe Him. I mean, to forget about His goodness in that sense. Every breath I breathe, every ounce of my life has been given to me by God. And it's kind of hard not to have a broken spirit toward Him when there's a humility that recognizes that. You know, when we start to get bent sideways with God, when we start saying things like this, why are you doing this to me? Because we're forgetting that every breath, everything we have is His. And we feel like He doesn't have the right to take something away. The next thing is a call to surrender. Look at 13, verse 17. When Pharaoh finally let the people go, God did not lead them along the main road that runs through Philistine territory, even though that was the shortest route to the promised land. God said, if the people are faced with a battle, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So it was God's divine plan and divine will. God led them in a roundabout way through the wilderness toward the Red Sea. I love that. God led them in a roundabout way. Not the way they would have picked. Not the shortest distance between 2 points. Not the way they were expecting God to do it. But God had a bigger plan, something different in mind, and He led them in His way, which seemed kind of roundabout to them. And thus the Israelites left Egypt like an army ready for battle. And then verse 20, the Israelites left Succoth and they camped at Etham and the edge of the wilderness. And the Lord went ahead of them and He guided them during the day with a pillar of cloud and provided light at night with a pillar of fire. And this allowed them to travel by day or night. And the Lord did not remove the pillar of cloud or the pillar of fire from its place in front of the people. God said, not only, I'm going to lead you. I'm going to lead you every step of the way. Let me tell you something about your story. It is about finding step with God. That's what my story's been about. It's about realizing that I'm trying to get ahead of God, or realizing that God is trying to drag me along and I don't want to go. It's about finding God's will. It's about following Him, walking with Him. You may be here this morning and you may say, Pastor Mike, I'm in that roundabout way right now. I mean, I told God, the shortest distance to where I think you're wanting me to go is right here. So that's where we're going, right? No, I want you to go. I'm going to do this roundabout thing with you that you can't predict and you can't know and you don't understand. And it may not even make sense to you, but it's going to be what I'm doing. And God has a way of doing that. You know where He took them in this roundabout way? Instead of just getting on over there and moving on to where they were supposed to be, He takes them in this roundabout way. He pushes them right up against the Red Sea at a place where they can't cross on foot. They can't cross without a bridge, and there weren't bridges or boats, and they didn't have those. And there's a mountain on this side and a mountain on this side and the Red Sea in front of them. They were literally trapped, a couple million people. And you know who's behind them? A really angry Pharaoh and a bunch of army guys and soldiers and rattling their swords and spears and chariots, pursuing them, going to punish them for what they're experiencing, the pain that God brought in their life. And there they are, trapped. And God says, yeah, I want to do something big. You may find yourself in a roundabout way this morning. You may say, God, I have no clue. My life is upside down right now. And I can look back on my life and see those same times in my life when nothing made sense and it was upside down. And now when I look back, I can realize God was in charge of all of that, even though I didn't feel like it was under control. The last thing is, so we surrender to Him. We surrender to walk with Him and His will in our lives. And there's a call to faith. Look at chapter 14, verse 10. As Pharaoh approached the people of Israel, looked up, and panicked. Did you ever look at your circumstances and then lose sleep and find yourself worrying about it, having anxiety, unable to eat? They panicked when they saw the Egyptians overtaking them, and they cried out to the Lord, and they said to Moses, hey, why'd you bring us out here to die in the wilderness? Weren't there enough graves for us in Egypt? What have you done to us? We said, leave us alone. Let us be slaves to the Egyptians. It's better to be a slave in Egypt than a corpse in the wilderness. Verse 12, didn't we tell you this would happen? I mean, they're in the middle of all that going on, and they've still got the, told you so. Told you so. Didn't we tell you this was going to happen? I told you so. And there's all this panic and this anxiety because their fear had come upon them. Didn't work the way they thought it would, and they were wondering about what's going to happen next, and they didn't know, and they were scared. They lashed out at Him. You know, they thought their choices, I'll just finish with this. They said, man, they looked at their life at that moment, and you may be in the same situation today. They looked at their life and they said this, here are my choices. I either go back there and be a slave, or I stay here and I die. I do the will of God and it totally falls apart. My life is over. Everything's ruined. Or I can go back to where I felt like I had some kind of control. At least I knew what to expect. You were in slavery. Yeah, but at least I knew what to expect. I'd rather be a live slave than a dead free man. And that's what happens to us when we get to that point. What we fail to recognize is there's a third option. The third option is to stand back and watch God do what He's been planning to do all along. To watch Him do what He intends to do. The reason that He's got you stuck is because He wants you to glorify Him. Moses doesn't get the credit. The people don't get the credit. We were just bigger and badder than them Egyptians. No, you know who gets the credit? God gets the credit. Because the third option was this: go back and be a slave, but I don't want you in slavery. I want to give you freedom. And you think right now that your life is over and the worst case scenario has happened, but I am honestly working to do something incredible if you'll let me. And the third option was that. Stand back and watch the deliverance of a mighty God work in ways that we can't predict. Our story is about that. It's about God coming around and around with us, giving us chances to believe Him in spite of the circumstances. And our stories come together, each one of us in the room today coming with a different story. And our story together makes a story of Cornerstone. And I want to challenge us as a ministry. I want to challenge us to take steps of faith, to want to be in a place where if God doesn't do it, it's not going to happen. To love God enough and believe Him enough. To look back just long enough to say He's done it in the past and I'm just going to trust Him that He will tomorrow too. I'm going to ask you to pray with me as